Okay. Right. Well, welcome to everybody. Hold on.
You're live.
Right. Good evening, everybody. It's 5:05. Hopefully that will be the only hitch this evening. I'm sure you'll all be pleased. Do not higher performance, etc. But please do remember your phones on. First item is meeting.
You got apologies, Chairman, from Catherine Hobbs and Rob Sanders.
No others. Right, thank you. The minutes from the last meeting, like to see if anybody has any comments, or otherwise I will sign them as being a true record. I need a proposer and seconder, please. Councillor Cameron, and seconded by Councillor Love. Could Councillor Brading please turn your camera off so that we only have committee members on the screen? Right. The next one will be declarations of interest from the committee, please, if there are any.
I'm a governor at Holy Cross Primary School.
Councillor Henry, yes. To a governor at Paydens Primary School, and Councillor Cameron.
I'm chairman of the Freshwater Early Years Centre. It's independent, but I'm chairman there, so I think it counts.
Are you a governor? Councillor Fuller, can you hear us?
No declarations, Chairman.
Right. Fine. Now, public question time is the next item, and at the moment, I think Matthew Price wanted to declare an interest. Sorry, Matthew Price.
Yes, thanks, Chairman. Just to say that I'm a governor at Barton Primary School.
So if members could leave members of the committee could leave your cameras on, and then we can see if you want to speak or make sure that the connection's still live. So just the members of the committee, if you can put your cameras on, please. On mute, obviously.
Public question time.
None received.
So none received. So we will move on to the next item, which is the response and recovery COVID-19. This is over to Mr.
I'll kick us off, Chair. I'm at a slight disadvantage in not having the agenda to hand, and doesn't seem to be published on the Isle of Wight website, which is where I normally access it. The presentation, who is going to project that? Do you want me to project that, Marie, or are you going to do it?
If you have it to hand, I can put it up on the screen.
No, I've got it to hand. It's okay. If as long as you don't mind, I'll do it, and that'll probably be easier. So what I'll do, Chair, if I may, is just introduce the item, and I'm going to hand over in due course to colleagues with regards to the various bits of this, and I'll come in for an early years section whereby one of our colleagues is on leave. You'll know that since the COVID pandemic hit in the middle of March, we've had to respond really quickly in terms of what we do, both in terms of schools and in terms of services for vulnerable children. I also know that through the corporate scrutiny committee, you've had a good look at the overall response of the council. What we'll hope to do tonight is to give you sort of the next layer down, if I can put it that way, which is more sort of detail and more grit in terms of the work that we've been doing across the island, both in all aspects of children's services. I want to put on record as the director my thanks to all of our staff and all of our leaders on the island and those who have a shared role across Hampshire and the Isle of Wight for getting our services or ensuring our services have continued running throughout this. And I would hope that members can ultimately will take assurance from what they hear tonight, although there's plenty of scope for questions and comments. On the topic of which I did receive a list of questions and comments, and I'm absolutely confident that we will be able to answer all of those things tonight, and we'll go through them. But if there is anything that you don't feel that has not been answered, please ask it. We've got evidentially some of the best children's services leaders in the country here tonight who can answer your questions and will know the answers to those questions. And if they don't, then they will get back to you with a written answer very quickly. But I'd be really confident about the activity, about the questions that we can answer. Okay, so what I'll do, if it's okay with you, Chair, I will then ask Stuart to lead us off with around the children and families work, and then I'll ask Brian to talk with regards to schools, and then I'll pick up some of the early years and home to school transport issues. Would you prefer us to stop for questions after each section, or would you like us to go through the whole report and then stop for questions? Can you just give me a steer on that?
I think, to be fair, after each section, otherwise by the time it gets to the end.
Yeah, you might have.
Yeah.
If we okay, that's absolutely fine. So we'll pause at the end of the children and families section for questions on that. At which point I'll hand over to Stuart for this bit. And Stuart, you give me a nudge when you want me to change slides. So I'll go on to the first slide.
Will do. Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Chair, and good evening, members. I know there's some new members on the committee, so for those that don't know me, I'm Stuart Ashley. I'm the Assistant Director for the Children and Families branch, which predominantly is children's social care, but it also includes early help, youth offending, and a range of services around social care. I'll go through the slides relatively quickly because I know members would have had an opportunity to see them beforehand, but I'll talk about our approach to managing the situation during COVID, what we did, what that meant in terms of practice, and then some lessons learned and things we might want to take away for the future, or indeed go back to if that becomes necessary. So next slide, please. So what was our approach? Well, at the beginning, we were advised by Public Health that we should prepare for up to 60% of our staff being absent at the peak of the pandemic. And some of my colleagues across the country immediately went onto what I would call a DEFCON 1. They took back and stopped doing essential services. That approach that we, in my service, ready to have a three-phase approach. Phase 1 being 20% off, phase 2 40, and phase 3 60. And I'm pleased to say that we never moved out of phase 1. So in phase 1 we were business as usual but doing it differently. At the height of staff absences, we had about 22% self-isolating. It didn't necessarily mean they weren't able to work, it just meant that they were self-isolating. So in that top box there, you can see statutory timescales for our visits and meetings remained exactly the same. We just used technology far more. So we were phoning some families, we were using apps such as Teams, as in tonight, so that we could see children, speak to families, conduct our business with the courts. I know there was a question around, is there a backlog with the courts? Not particularly, because the courts were open and we were doing virtual hearings. So we were able to undertake a lot of our work as normal, just through the use of technology. We did prioritise the front door. So we wanted to keep the MASH, the multi-agency safeguarding hub, cost, as we did our residential home, Newley House, because those children didn't have anywhere else to go, those that were residents. And we also prioritised the support to our foster parents, because we needed them to continue to support our children. And I'll come back to it in a later slide. Next slide, please. So one of the things that I was very clear on was that if staff are working from home, and 99.5% of staff were working from home, so came into the office at various points, but the significant working at home, that they need to be supported and safe in carrying on with their work. So we were really focused on maintaining our management grip, as we called it. So when we issued new guidance, we issued guidance about how you do a virtual visit to make sure you see the child's bedroom, and if necessary to see that there's food in the house. We made sure that the timescales for visits and meetings were maintained. We made sure that frontline practitioners had much more contact, daily contact from their managers.
Stuart, you're just breaking up on us a little bit.
Colleagues, I'll turn my camera off. That hopefully you can hear me. Just tell me, Steve, if I need to go back over anything, please. So strategically, I made sure that we had daily senior management meetings. I had a clear action tracker. So we did make a lot of decisions on a day-to-day basis that you wouldn't normally make outside of a lockdown and a pandemic. We had a clear audit track because we knew, rightly, at some point we would be before yourselves, or Ofsted would ask us, why did you make certain decisions? So we've got good trails around that. Importantly, we developed a small performance data set so that we could see that our core business was happening on a day-to-day basis. And I'm really pleased to say it did, without fail, continue on a day-to-day basis. Next slide, please. I will go through some of the slides more quickly, but this one I just want to touch on in a little bit more detail. So what you can see there is, if you look at the top, the number of referrals into children's social care. In March 19, so a year before lockdown, we were at 422. In March 20, we were at 412 because lockdown came late in March. And you can see the difference there in the April figures. So we were down by quite a significant percentage as once lockdown took place. But this is a really important point. By May, despite the majority of children not being in school and schools being the main referrer to children's social care, by May we were back to normal levels. In June and July, we were at 15 to 20% above normal levels of demand. And I have to say, members, I think, and I want the committee to note this, I think that's likely to be sustained. And come September, when all of the schools have all of the children back, I would expect that number to go up even further. That will put pressure on the service, and we rightly have had to plan ahead and think about making sure we've got additional resource so that we can service that. And I'm confident that we have. We've got some additional posts that we've been able to put to one side so that we've retained several agency social workers in anticipation of sustained demand. Just one last point on this slide, we have seen an increase in the numbers of children coming into care. In some ways that's because they haven't been able to leave care as easily. So if they've turned 18, they haven't necessarily wanted to go and live in a flat on their own for the understandable reasons of lockdown. So we have slightly artificially high numbers of children in care, but I think longer term we will see a continued upward trend in that as well. Next slide, please. So how did we work with our children and families? It was technology, I have to say. All of the apps that are available and we had access to, we were able to employ and use, so that all of the activity on the right-hand side of this slide, such as life story work, an important piece of work so children understand their own story of why they're in care, the reviews for children in care, preparing children to become a care leaver. All of that work continued just through the use of technology. I would point out, though, that where we needed to see a child because we thought they were at immediate risk, staff still undertook face-to-face visits. So we didn't do every single visit through technology. If we had an urgent child protection matter, then staff had access to PPE and they would go and see the child and the family, usually with the police. Next slide, please. I won't go through all of this slide, but what I would say is our staff have worked relentlessly to support our children in care. They've been having quiz days and evenings, they've been having talent shows, come dine with me, virtually a whole range of activity to keep those children in care engaged. A small number, usually older teenagers, have struggled with lockdown. You'll have seen that nationally, it's an issue. On the island, it has only been a very small number, and staff have really gone out of their way to engage those young people, to make them safe and to help stabilise their placements. And we'll come on to foster carers in the next slide, if I could please, Steve. Our foster carers have received children into their homes where they may well have come from a home where there's COVID-19. They have not asked children to leave the placements, even if they've shown disruptive and challenging behaviour. They've gone over and above, as have the social workers in supporting them. And I think we should take great pride in what they've done to maintain our most vulnerable children in their homes and keep them safe. And the same for Bewley House in terms of our residential service. Staff really have been remarkable in the way they've adapted, but kept their absolute focus on keeping children safe. Next slide, please. Partnership working has been a growing strength on the island, and the pandemic and lockdown has really tested that. I'm really pleased to say it's gone from strength to strength. In fact, it's now at the best I think I've ever known it in my 7 years of working on the island. Certainly between children's social care and the police, it was hand in glove. We were sharing information about the most vulnerable adults and children that we needed to, for one agency or the other to see. We've made sure that we've responded when families have gone into crisis. And unfortunately, on occasions, we've had to go in and protect children, but we've been able to do that together. So a really joined up approach. And that's no different with health partners as well. We have a slightly, you'd understand, a slightly different relationship with them in terms of child protection, but equally they have been hand in glove with us in terms of responding to the needs of our families. Next slide, please. And I've said this, but I'll say it again. We've had to offer our staff a lot of support. They deal with really very difficult and emotionally challenging situations outside of a pandemic and outside of lockdown, but actually being on your own and having to undertake that work was absolutely a challenge for them. And we supported, you can see from the slide, there's even Steve there on a video. I had to wear pajamas at one point to entertain people, but actually staying in touch with the workforce and making sure that they're okay has been a key part of our success. Next slide, please. And I won't go through this in detail. It just talks about how we have stayed in touch with staff and that their welfare has been paramount for us. Next slide, please. I won't go through this in detail. I'll let members read this, but we've had some remarkable feedback from staff and families about how they have felt supported, how the technology has benefits. One of the best examples I can give you of that is some of our older teenagers, actually, they found it so much easier to have virtual conversations with social workers because that's how they live their lives anyway. It's us that's had to play catch up in that regard. So there's been some real positive learning from this. And I know there was a question about will we be able to maintain some of what we've learnt that works. There may need to be some changes to regulations, but I know that across the country in children's social care services, the lessons are the same, that some virtual use of WhatsApp and Teams type contact with older children and care leavers is really beneficial. And I'm certain that the Department for Education will move to agree that that should happen more. In certain cases, it shouldn't happen all of the time, of course, but on certain occasions, it's beneficial. Next slide, please. So on the left-hand side, what worked well? Clearly, the adaptability of our staff. I think the leadership across the service and across children's services has been really strong. The use of IT, as I've said, has been particularly helpful. So what didn't work well and what might we do to learn from that? I think it's sensitive HR meetings, whether that's a disciplinary or some other meeting, they can be quite difficult if they're done remotely. So what we're looking at doing now is having a hybrid. So you might have some people in the room and some people dialing in virtually. I think that would be a good solution longer term while social distancing remains. Equipment is always an issue for people. The council has been very accommodating in terms of screens and chairs, but it's taken some getting used to. I think we've moved on from that now. And then the last point, and we're doing some more work on this, and there's some work going on nationally around parenting assessments. Social worker has to go into court and their assessment is their evidence. They need to know and feel sure that they've covered all of the bases. And that can be quite hard when you do that virtually. So there's some work going on to make that a more robust process. Next slide, please. So what's next? We're emerging from lockdown. Increasing numbers of visits are now face-to-face. Meetings are increasingly hybrid meetings with some family in the room, other professionals dialing in, and we will maintain that as we need to. And thinking about our foster carers as well, thinking about what's worked for them through this, the increased support has clearly been beneficial, so that's something we want to maintain. Next slide, please. And really this just repeats that, what I've said in terms of there will be some new things that we want to maintain and some things that we will need to reflect on to make it work better in the future. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, that phrase business as usual but doing it differently, I must have said that 1,000 times over the last 4 months, but the message has been well received, and it's been our approach to making sure that we keep doing things and keep children safe. The management grip, I'm confident, has been strong, and our practitioners and foster carers and others have really adapted well. And then the partnership working, as I said, has been an asset. So I think that's the last slide from me, members. Thank you.
I will come in here. Thank you very much, Mr. Ashley. That was brilliant, and it seemed to have covered most things. Now I will pass it over to my committee. Does anybody have a question for Stuart Ashley, please? If you do, indicate and Paul will bring you in. Councillor Cameron.
Thank you, Chairman. Good afternoon. I just wonder, it's been a very good presentation. Thank you very much, and thank the officers for giving us this presentation. I just wonder, there's indications that we still deliver the same service, but we'll be working slightly different. Are we talking about a different strategy altogether with an action plan attached to that, or just maybe just alter the current strategy we have got to deliver the service? Thank you.
Thank you for that question. Our core business will remain as is. Our business plan and our transformation work will continue as is. It's just that we have the flexibility now that should staff be required to go into lockdown again, that we can maintain our service. So I think what we've done is just adapt, and we're now adapting back to where we were before. Who knows if there's a second wave, etc. I'm confident that the service is agile enough to be able to move into lockdown and out of it without any disruption to the service.
That's great. Thank you very much.
Yes, Councillor Fuller. Councillor Fuller, can you unmute? You've got your mic button That's better.
Thank you. Yeah, there's a couple of issues. You gave some stats, Stuart. How do those stats compare nationally? And also the other thing that I wanted to ask about getting through this phase was, what were the biggest challenges that you faced, and how are you adapting what you're doing to deal with those challenges for the future? Because I think the way we are looking is this hybrid hybrid working is going to be with us now probably forever. You know, I think we've fallen behind for so long, and I think this is the way things are going to go. But I just really want to know, you know, what are the major challenges that you see to doing this in the future, and how do we compare in Hampshire and the Isle of Wight to the national picture? Are there issues nationally that we're not seeing in Hampshire, or are we seeing the same problems locally that there are across the country? Or are you just doing a fantastic job here and people elsewhere aren't doing so well?
Well, I'll lead off on that, and we are doing a fantastic job here, but that's a given. But what is, because I've got some of the national data, and it's very, very varied. And I think that my interpretation of that is that there are a number of factors that determine the degree to which the Children's Services Department has locked itself down. So some authorities went very deeply into lockdown. Yeah. Now those factors are not a pejorative statement, they're just different. So it depends on the amount of staff you've had off sick. It depends upon the technology that you've got available, etc., etc. And we have been, I would describe our lockdown as fairly shallow in a positive sense, in that we've come down a bit and we've gone back up again. But that's been, I think, a very helpful way for us to deal with it, because it means that we have less far to come back up. So some authorities that went deeply down then found a massive increase. So some authorities that I'm aware of are saying they've had 150% increase in referrals, whereas ours is 15%. And I would rather that gradual slope rather than a big drop off and a big sort of comeback. So I think we're in a positive place, but the factors that determine the degree to which you had to lock down, not within any authority's control, but that's really determined the levels of demand in the short term. I think in the longer term, most authorities will experience something in the region of 15 to 20% increase in activity if you look over the course of, say, the next year, because history tells us that's the sort of the number we might expect from this event when we look at other shocks to the system in children's social care, like Baby P or the austerity, that all led to about a 15 to 20% increase. OK, so I'll be quiet, and Stuart's going to pick up the question on the challenges.
In some ways, the challenges actually have brought benefits, because if 4 months ago you told me that I was going to be delivering most of my work via Teams, I would have laughed. But actually, we're finding that it works, and that we're having lots of meetings, and we're having better attendance at meetings because the police can dial in, the GP can dial in. So the challenges around adapting to the technology have actually been really beneficial, I think. Now, one of the challenges for the social work profession going forward, if we have this sort of hybrid approach, and I think you're right, Councillor Fuller, I think that's probably the way it will be for some time. Social workers, by their nature, benefit from getting together with their team and reflecting on some of the issues that they face, whether that's a debrief about a difficult visit that they've done, or a concerning case that they've come across. We need to think about how they can do that. So we need to maintain some face-to-face contact for our service. And I think that's important, that we don't just switch over completely to using Teams or other technology. There's something about our profession that benefits from time spent together reflecting on casework. So that's something that we need to think about. But the rest of the challenges, I have to say, as I said in the presentation, staff and service users have adapted remarkably.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Steve. So.
If I would just make a comment here that human nature is a very adaptable animal. As long as we don't allow the IT to become the master, but to utilise it as a better servant, which is what everybody has done, it's proved tremendously encouraging. Thank you.
Chairman, we've got Councillor Love and Councillor Dale.
Councillor Love, next, please.
Thank you, and thank you for your report, which I enjoyed reading. I think it does raise a number of particular questions. You know, hybrid IT management in terms of teams is okay, but it's not quite the same thing for me, because I like to look at people's body language. I like to look people in the eyes, so we mustn't lose that, particularly when we think about the challenges that raises for safeguarding issues and working with young people. It's easy to sit behind a camera and hide, you know, the persona, so as to say. It's quite important that we don't lose that completely. So I want to come across to what I really wanted to talk about, really, which is going back to slide 5 and the statistical data there. And it's more of an observation, really. It really concerns me that the figures are going up, and that wasn't unexpected in terms of child protection, but and safeguarding. But what I would want to do is to ensure, Chair, that this is brought back to us at the moment as a priority at each meeting, so that we can be sure that things are progressing. And it's just about the local authority reassuring us that everything is in place that they need, and identifying any resources that you need early, if you haven't already got them, so that can be passed along the chain to scrutiny and cabinet and so on. So that's my pleas, is that we bring this back at each meeting, because it is difficult for me to be able to, you know, there's a lot of people in this meeting, and I like to look at people's faces and see what's going on with them. So, because that tells me a lot about what's happening behind what we see on the screen. And so the other point is that I could just say a little bit more about how we're actually trying to engage with young people through young people's forums online, pull them into the conversation, because I want to be assured that we are reaching out as far as we possibly can to young people who are at risk in any way, shape or form. Thank you for giving me that time to say that.
Thank you.
Okay, so just on, we'll deal with those separately. The resources issue, I know that Stuart's already got sort of plans afoot on that. It's up to you, Chair, obviously, whether you want the issue to come back up. There's no objections from us as officers, certainly. But Stuart, do you just want to outline the early steps we've taken around planning for the surge, as it were?
Yes, so I've already got 4 additional agency social workers within the service, which actually the Isle of Wight Children's Social Care Service has very low numbers of agency social workers, remarkably so, actually, and talks about the good reputation and the good retention that we have. But we've actually kept agency social workers on the basis that we are going to face a likely spike in demand. So we were ahead of the curve in that. We thought right at the beginning, actually, let's not let anybody leave for the sake of 2 or 3 months. Let's just keep things going so that we can respond to increased demand. We've also put additional social workers into the MASH, Multi-Agency Safeguarding Hub. That's been, as you would expect, exceptionally busy. We've also put additional resource into out of hours. One of the surprising things, and you know, I learn something every day. One of the surprising things from lockdown was that we almost turned into a 24/7 service. So out of hours typically would be relatively busy between 5 and 10 o'clock on a Friday, but actually we're finding it's busy between 5 o'clock when the day offices close, right through till 3, 4 o'clock in the morning, every day of the week now. And that's because I do think in lockdown people's lives changed a bit. They lost their routines, and so different things were happening within communities, and so we've just seen extra demand right around the clock. But we've been able to respond to that. We have the capacity and flexibility. I suppose there's a longer term question, isn't there, about where that goes, where we find ourselves in a year's time, 2 years' time. And I think we need to do some proper modelling over the next 3-4 months to better understand what that looks like and what that means in terms of resources. The second question, I think, reaching out to young people and how we safeguard them. Remember that nothing's changed. Early help services have continued, Bernardo's have continued delivering their services. We're still getting the referrals in. We still have our hype group hearing young people's experience. We still have our corporate parenting board. The schools, we've worked really closely with the schools, as Brian will go on to talk about, to make sure that vulnerable children were going to school wherever possible. And where they weren't going to school, then social workers were undertaking a risk assessment on those children. And if necessary, going and visiting them so that we understood that they were safe. The online issue is an important one, and I think it's a really interesting challenge for us. There's almost the opposite of that. What about those children that didn't have access to technology? The Department for Education did issue a number of laptops for us, which I think, again, Brian will touch on, so I won't go through that. But we have been able to help some children get online to help with their learning and to stay in contact with wider family and support services such as children's social care. So I think we've got a good story to tell, but in fairness, we were learning as we went along because it was a new world for all of us.
Thank you, Stuart. Somebody else had a question. Councillor Downer. Oh, Councillor Downer, are you there, please?
Oh, thank you, Chairman. Apologies for the delay. It's a bit rural, Wroxall, you know that. Thank you, and thank you, Stuart, for your presentation. Just a very quick question about, have you seen an increase in calls to the MASH with alcohol and drug related subjects? Thank you.
That's a good question. Yes, we have seen we've seen an increase in calls to the MASH, and we've seen an increase in calls to the MASH where there have been issues of domestic violence, substance misuse, including alcohol, and also adult mental health. So the three factors that we know are the core of most of the families that we work with, that we've seen a rise in that. The work that's been coming in through the front door has been more complex than we've seen at any time, actually. And we think that's because some of the support services that families might have accessed at an earlier stage, they weren't accessing because of lockdown, so they went into crisis, and so therefore we've been picking them up, unfortunately, once they've hit crisis. And invariably that means that the situation is more difficult to resolve. The short answer is yes.
Thank you, Stuart. Can we move on now to the next session, please?
Okay, thank you. I'll come back into the presentation if you just bear with me a second. So you should be, hopefully you're seeing that presentation on the screen.
Yes.
Yep. Okay. So I'll same thing really. I'll ask Brian to walk us through this, and Brian, just give me a nudge when you want me to change the slide, please.
Okay, if you could change the slide then, please, Steve. Thanks.
Yeah.
Good evening.
What I've tried to do, members, is to kind of do the story of lockdown over the last 3 or 4 months. So you'll see I've started off right at the beginning, back in mid-March, because there were very clear phases, I think, in this in education. So if you recall, the Prime Minister, I think, made an announcement on the Thursday that at the end of Friday, the 20th of March, that all schools should close and then reopen again on Monday, but to offer childcare, and it was particularly aimed at two groups, the children of critical workers and vulnerable children. There was a list of critical workers produced by the DFE, so the Department for Education produced a list of who counted as being a critical workers. The definition of vulnerable children was produced by the department, but we extended it on the Isle of Wight. So the department had those children open to social care, children in need, those on a child protection plan and looked after children, and children on an education, health and care plan. We all felt it was important to add in those children that were on early help as well. In many ways, some of our looked after children potentially are safer than children at the early help, where we're still working through the kind of information around the children. So we extended the definition on the island. Next slide, please, Steve. Awful lot of work with head teachers and schools in the first couple of weeks. You'll recall there was a lot of conflicting advice around critical workers. Some of the professional associations have put advice out there saying both parents had to be going to work before people would qualify. Actually, that wasn't what the DfE's guidance said. It was just one parent was sufficient to get you a place in a school. So we had to work through a number of issues with parents who were complaining they couldn't get school places. We then put in place a partnership approach actually to vulnerable children open to social care with social care colleagues, colleagues from the school improvement team and head teachers, whereby we expected every school to send us a submission on every Friday on whether or not any child open to social care had been into school. So we provided each school with the names of children that were open to the different teams and checked on it on a Friday to make sure that whether those children had been in or not. If they hadn't been in, that was a flag for Stuart's team to make sure that we got oversight of those children in a different way. And we started off the first few weeks with about 8% of those children in. That's topped 40% in the last week now. So we improved the numbers coming in from those groups over time. For those children with an EHCP, the guidance from the government on that was to undertake a risk assessment, and that children should only come into school if they were safe or safer in schools compared to being at home. So schools know the children best of all, they know their families best of all, and they took charge of undertaking those risk assessments. We sampled those risk assessments on a weekly basis and did some quality assurance to check the quality was good. And currently there's about 28% of children with an EHCP in school. Next slide, please, Steve. The other bit that came in quite early on was schools had to adapt rapidly around home learning. And you'll be aware that schools have autonomy to determine the way that they teach the curriculum, their approach to learning, and that's no different when it comes to home learning either. But what I'd say is all schools tried to make sure that it wasn't just looking at a computer screen. The idea of having children in front of a computer screen for hour after hour after hour was not one that head teachers thought would be good, particularly given that much of the leisure time can be screen based as well. So often first-hand experiential learning, had schools producing daily blogs, resource packs that went home on a daily basis, emails to parents sending work out, and they tried to break it down into manageable chunks. We had a number of parents saying to schools that giving the children a week's worth of work was overwhelming, and they felt it was a lot better to get it a little bit more often and to get the quality rather than quantity right. We tried to make sure that the home learning was family friendly, recognising that parents aren't all subject specialists, and we wanted something that could be enjoyable for parents to do with the children as well as focused on the learning. There's been some online learning with teachers videoing themselves, putting particularly lesson introductions up on YouTube, children watching that, which has then led to work being undertaken. But at the heart of any good teaching and learning process is feedback. So the teachers checking the children's work and giving feedback as to any misconceptions, how they can improve their learning. And heads have been brilliant in making sure that feedback has been given. There's been wide support from the DfE on home learning. The Oak Academy was set up and that provided lessons that schools could draw on. Our school improvement team produced weekly lessons that schools could use to send home to mums and dads. And then there was the BBC home learning that was on the television as well. And just to give you some information as to the kind of things we've been engaged with, we were asked by the Department for Education to check the content of the BBC's offer right at the start of this, and we spent a good 6 hours one evening looking at the commission for the BBC to provide the home learning. So we were involved in that as well. Next slide, please. We've tried to make sure there's been sufficient support to schools. So the education team has been in contact with every single head teacher on the island at least once a week. Some head teachers have wanted conversations more regularly than that, particularly those in small primary schools where they may not have extended leadership teams. They're wanting to engage with one of our school improvement team to kind of talk things through. Governor Services have dealt with a whole range of questions and offered support to governing bodies where they've been asked to do that. We took the decision right at the start, and I think it was the right decision to take, that we wouldn't put out contradictory guidance to the DfE. The DfE's guidance has been based upon the Public Health England's guidance, and we basically positioned ourselves around that and said that should be followed. Steve and myself both joke that we've both got a grade B in biology, and actually the chief scientific advisor's qualifications are a lot more robust than that. So we've positioned ourselves behind his advice. Regularly, we've been producing advice, frequently asked questions to exemplify the DfE guidance within the Isle of Wight context, and got that out to schools, and schools have really welcomed and valued that. We then produced 3 think pieces, which again we did fairly early on in the process, to think about the questions that primary schools, secondary schools and special schools would need to be asking themselves as they prepared for wider reopening. And we worked with a group of primary heads to produce a primary version of that. We worked with a group of secondary heads and a group of special school heads as well, across both or authorities, and those think pieces went down well as well. Thanks, Steve. We've had a major focus on well-being and mental health. There's been a huge signposting of support out there, both for staff, because working from home, if you're a teacher, there's new experience and you'll be aware of the potential knock-on effects on well-being. So there's been advice go out to schools around staff, but also pupils, and that advice is in place ready for September as well, when children come back in larger numbers. Stuart's team very kindly went through every single child that was open to social care and highlighted those ones that had not got access to laptops. We have an officer called Sue Savoury who liaised with the DfE and sourced 300 devices for those children. Those were delivered to the island and are out now with those children open to social care. Schools were asked to put in place a bid for students that are categorised as disadvantaged, i.e. those on free school meals in year 10, and they put in bids to the DfE, and those laptops have also been delivered and are being used as well. We set up an information cell, and that's taken inquiries direct from parents throughout. We've dealt with a number of parents, particularly about finding school places, but also about worries that they had about sending their children back. We've dealt with dozens of inquiries from head teachers, from council staff, from governors, and the matters are really wide-ranging. Human resources, questions to do with free school meals, questions to do with money, with buildings, with personal protective equipment, public health questions. The media team have worked very closely with us on dealing with any media inquiries, and there have been some legal questions as well. And again, your legal department have been really good at working with us on that. Then came the 1st of June, which is when primary schools were asked to reopen to more children. Again, extensive advice from the DfE went to schools on this, which basically set the parameters that schools had to follow. So that was bubbles of no more than 15 children plus staff. Those bubbles had to be kept separate. They had separate start times, finish times, separate play times, separate lunch times. Huge emphasis on hygiene and cleaning. They made it clear to schools that they didn't want rotas undertaken, and that was really for public health issues. There were some schools that wanted one year group in the morning and another year group in the afternoon using the same spaces, and the DfE said no, that's not a good idea in terms of public health issues. They gave a priority order for return, and we had a lot of parents complaining about this, but we followed the DfE guidance. So first of all, schools had to work out how many teachers they'd got. And if you think typically that they've got a teacher for every 30 kids, if you suddenly only have 15 children being taught by a teacher, you can only have half the number of bubbles as you usually have classes. You can only have half the number of children. So critical workers and vulnerable children first. If there was still space available in bubbles, year 1 next. If there was still space available in bubbles, then year 1, and then finally year 6 if there were space available. That was the order the DfE asked people to do. I have to say the health and safety team on the island has worked really hard to assist schools with all the various risk assessments as well, and obviously the education team, the school improvement team, has been supportive with that effort as well. Next slide, please, Steve. I have to say my own take on this is head teachers and their staff have been magnificent throughout this period, working their way through this with all the different challenging circumstances and the different messages. Teachers are no different from the rest of the population. You've got some that were very, very nervous about coming back to school, others that were really gung-ho and just wanted to come back whatever the circumstances, and then the rest of us, the rest of teachers in the kind of middle of that normal distribution curve. Professional associations, you will have heard the requirements of unions have been quite loud, and I think it's right that people were advocating for staff safety, so I'm not saying that was a bad thing. It's an important voice to have in the conversation. Parents, Steve has had emails in from parents critical because their children haven't been able to get back in. Other parents have been critical because their children have been allowed back in, so there's been some work with the parental body as well. Then there's been the DfE, then the media. We called in our media statements through the ones that Councillor Braden did for patience, to give schools a bit of time to get those arrangements in place. And after the 1st of June, we then had 2,100 students in the Isle of Wight. So we had good numbers of primary age children coming back. Can I say that the island had one of the highest attendance records anywhere in the country? So the DfE were ringing me up to say, it's really interesting, your attendance stats, you've got more children attending than most other authorities in the country. How are you doing that? And largely that was done by head teachers who know their families best of all, having conversations with families to reassure them to come back to school. Next slide, please. Then the 15th of June, and I think it's true to say that many secondary heads were disappointed by the public health guidance on this, but again, we have to be led by the scientific advice through Public Health England. So the demand there was only year 10, that should be some face-to-face, but supplemented by remote learning, and that you could only have 25% of year 10 on site at any one time. And year 12, where applicable, A-level students should also start to get some face-to-face learning as well. On the island, in the last couple of weeks, we've had broadly 3,900, 4,000 students back in, depending on the day that the attendance return is looked at. We also put an awful lot of work into secondary schools with the system for awarding GCSE grades. You'll be aware that there's been a national algorithm created which looks at where students were at the end of primary school, looks at the progress that students typically make in each individual school, and have multiplied that up to work out what kind of grades those students should have been expected to get. And that's been backed up by a teacher assessment model as well, but the algorithm comes first. For some of the non-core subjects, so for example things like design technology, the lack of coursework with several months to go meant that some of those judgments around teacher assessment was quite challenging, and they were asking our subject inspectors some advice as to how they might make that teacher assessment. So we did a lot of work alongside schools on the teacher assessment. Next slide, please. Similar to Stuart, teams have been just cracking on and doing things as usual but differently. The SEN team on the island has been phenomenal. If people have been putting applications in for EHCPs, we are still meeting the 20-week deadline for assessing those, well above the national average with the way that those EHCPs have been produced. The educational psychology team again has done some fantastic work dealing with some difficult and sad incidents on the island, actually, some support direct to children where sad family incidents have occurred, but also some of the teams that have been dealing with COVID pandemic up close. The psychology team have been providing some support for those people as well. The inclusion team, you'll be pleased to know, didn't have to deal with any exclusions because there was no official school, so nobody could be excluded. And obviously attendance was not mandatory, so they've not been chasing up attendance. But that team has done some really extensive work with parents actually in schools in trying to make sure that vulnerable children are back in school. The virtual school has worked flat out trying to make sure we get as many children in care in school. And finally, I'd just mention the Island Futures team, which deals with the careers advice. And you can imagine that students in year 11 and 13 who ordinarily would have done GCSEs and A-levels have been worried about their futures. And the Island Futures team have done dozens of online conversations with those students, trying to make sure that they've got places to go post-summer in September. And I have to say the Isle of Wight College has been fantastic at reaching down to those students as well. So they've got good pathways into the kind of post-16 arena, but there's been a lot of conversations. Thank you, Steve. Next slide. Finally then, next steps. We're working with all schools now to ensure that they can open for all students from September. These are some of the issues we've been addressing, but as it stands at the moment, barring any change in the data or different advice from the DfE, we think we're in a position on the island where all schools will be able to open for all children from September. You'll be aware that some secondary schools often have year 7 in just before they have the rest of the year group in, and some schools are doing arrangements like that, which is just the same as they normally do. We're fine with that. There are some tensions, particularly in secondary school, about the size of the bubble and the size of potential lockdown. You'll be aware that in primary, bubbling, I wouldn't say it's easy, but it's easier because you've potentially got one class, one teacher and a learning support assistant, and that's your bubble, or you might have a bubble across a year group. With secondary, the children might be taught by 8 different subject specialists, and you need flexibility in staffing to enable those teachers to teach across different classes. So the size of bubble is important to get the flexibility, but equally you don't want it too large, because if there was an outbreak in a school, obviously the bigger the bubble, the bigger the size of the potential lockdown as well. And we've been working with secondary heads to try and work through some of that. Similarly, it's really simplistic to say this area in the secondary school will be for year 7, this for year 8, this for year 9. The problem is with doing it that way, you then restrict access to specialist spaces, and secondary schools haven't wanted to do that. So they've had to think through the place planning area really importantly. Some schools have ordered some additional furniture. One of the requirements of the DfE is that students should all face forward and not work in groups facing each other. So some of the furniture was round. So there's been some square furniture ordered in one or two schools. Absolutely key for September will be parental confidence. The DfE and public health will be running, and I know this was one of the questions I was asked, that they will be running a national campaign to try and engender good parental confidence. I think the best way of engendering parental confidence is actually through schools who know their families well, talking to the families that have got worries, to talk through those worries, to try and allay the fears. And what we've found is that when parents have expressed worries, when they've actually got their children into school, those worries have largely faded away and they've been confident then about sending them back in regularly. Behaviour is obviously going to be an issue that we really need to focus on. Children have missed, actually it's about 76 days of schooling, and we've got to get the culture right for all children when they restart in September. So there's a lot of work around behaviour intervention. I'm also worried about some students that may historically have had persistent absence, because some of the behaviours around that will be reinforced throughout lockdown, and we need to work with those children and those families to try and get those children back into education. And then finally, the last piece of work we've got to do is there will be cases of locking down of bubbles from September. I think it would be naive for us to think there won't be any cases. There clearly will. And we need to be in a position where we can move again to remote learning if we have to lock down a bubble of children and send those children home to self-isolate. So that's got to be in place, ready to go in the instance that happens. That's particularly needs to be true for year 11. It's important for all year groups, but for year 11, there have been modifications obviously for GCSEs this year. That probably won't be the case largely for next year. So if year 11 miss a chunk of learning, that will mitigate against them in their GCSEs. So we need to be able to get onto remote learning as quickly as possible. So big challenges, but again, just to finish off last couple of sentences, I can't speak highly enough of school leaders on the island. They have been phenomenal, the way they've worked through this, and their teaching and support staff. The way that they have all pulled together to try and make sure they've been able to educate as many children as possible has been absolutely outstanding, and we should be really proud of the school effort. Actually, they've done a great job. Thank you.
Thank you for that excellent presentation, Brian. I know from my experience at Haylands how hard the staff that have been there have worked. The stuff that has been put in place, and dare I say, thank goodness for Hampshire, because your overview and oversight has proved just incredible, and I'm sure the others will agree with me. Obviously, there will be the odd question or two from my fellow members in a moment, but really, it's been excellent, and I just can't thank you and your staff enough, because you have provided the facilities and most of all the leadership. So thank you for that. Now, just one point I would like to make. We haven't talked about home educated children. I don't know if you want to comment on that at all, or even if you can. I think one of the questions I would ask, and I thought about this some weeks ago, do you think more children will be home educated in future, or do you think it will possibly stay the same? If you could just answer that, Brian, then I will go to the rest of the committee.
Yeah, I think it's a really good question, Vanessa, and I'm meeting with other assistant directors across the South East, and the honest answer is nobody knows at this stage, and I think we need to wait to see what happens in September. In terms of those children that are currently elective home educated, their parents continue to electively home educate them as they would have done ordinarily. The EAG team, Louise Tatton, has continued to talk to those families and give the support that we normally give to those families. But in terms of Do I think more children will be EHE? There may be some parents that have fallen in love with this process during the pandemic. Equally, I've met an awful lot of parents who can't wait to get their children back at school as well.
Yes, I'm sure you're right about that, Brian. Right, now, questions from my fellow committee members, please. Brian, your presentation was obviously brilliant. Right, Councillor Fuller, please, first, and then followed by Councillor Downer.
Hi, Brian. Thank you for the presentation. It was fantastic, as always. One of the things I know I've learned from the anti-poverty group on the island is one of the exemplars of good practice that is in place is a video that is underway in Hampshire County Council. It's called Coming Out of Lockdown, and it's a really useful tool for a lot of the adults that are feeling very scared about coming out of lockdown. Is that going to be available to parents on the Isle of Wight as well as in Hampshire? Because it is a useful tool that we can use, because there seems to be still a lot of hesitancy with parents returning to school in September.
I've not seen that one used in Hampshire. What we've had in Hampshire and the island is a series of webinars with public health with school leaders. I'm not aware of anything that's been direct to the parents' body. What we've tried to do is to make sure that head teachers have been given sufficient information so that they can have those conversations. If you've got more information about that, Paul, please let me know and I'll follow it up. If we have done something in Hampshire we haven't done on the island, of course, yes, we'll follow that up.
Yeah, I'm not going to go on for too long, Vanessa, but you know, I think there is a lot of peer group pressure, not for the children, but particularly from parents, about making sure that they get things right. And I've had one parent come to me and saying, well, you know, from what our peers are telling us, we've done everything wrong, and we need to feel confident that we're sending our children back, and that our education that we've provided for them, that we've been supervising and overseeing, isn't going to embarrass us or our family. And they want to make sure that there are the tools available for them as parents to make sure that they are available to be able to hold their heads up high when they walk through the school gates on, you know, in the beginning of September. So I just, you know, what I'll try to do, Brian, is I'll try to get some information from the anti-poverty forum and supply that through to you. All right.
Of course. Can I just say on that, nobody will be judging parents on their teaching skills throughout lockdown.
Okay.
What schools are wanting is to get the children back as rapidly as possible, and it doesn't matter where they come back in terms of the knowledge that they've gained. You know, we will pick them up from where they come in, and we will make sure that we understand the experiences they've been through, and we will try and build the knowledge from that point, so that there certainly won't be any judging of parental skills. Although I have seen, and you will have seen them as well, many houses printing off Ofsted logos with Ofsted inadequate teaching going on here. I'm sure you've seen those in windows, same as I have. It's
yeah, the problem, I don't have any problem with the schools or with the local education authority. The problem that parents have are other parents. It's that banter that happens at the school gates, and that is what I would like to see overcome. And I think that's something that, as an authority, we have to be aware of that issue and address that, because again, there is huge peer pressure with mums, with parents at school gates, which is a real worry for me.
That's useful feedback, Paul. Thank you.
Okay.
It is. I just want to reiterate, though, Brian and I's sort of standing joke, which is not funny really, but is, you know, I've got an O level, I've got a B in O level biology, and I don't feel that I'm qualified to overrule the chief scientific officer. And if I'm honest, neither is somebody at the school gate, unless they happen to be the chief scientific officer. So that's where we should be taking our advice from.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
Right, Councillor Downer, please. Did you unmute, Rodney?
Is that better?
Yes,
Yeah,
perfect.
thank you. Yes, Councillor Fuller asked the question that I was going to ask about the levels of education going back into school after the parents have educated, and the stickers around our area for Ofsted are quite colourful. Going on to Ofsted though, Brian, when will they start their inspections again after school, and will there be some allowance made for the lockdown? I'm not a fan of Ofsted myself because they're very inconsistent, and they're very inconsistent, and they're not encouraging in any way. Thank you.
It's again a really good, insightful question, Rodney. So there won't be any Ofsted inspections next term, certainly. What they're going to be doing is some visits to schools to find out what they can learn about how schools have coped during COVID. So they'll be particularly looking at where children are coming in, having been home school for the last period of time, how the curriculum has been adapted, both to meet their well-being needs, but also their academic needs. And I suspect they'll also have quite a key focus on disadvantaged groups. There won't be any grades to that. So no school will be told they've done that good or outstanding or inadequately. But there will be a letter left with the school, which I gather the head teacher and the inspector will agree the content of. So it's going to be more inquiry during the autumn term, and hopefully that will be helpful. We've managed to get one of the Hampshire schools to be a pilot for that framework in the first couple of weeks of September. So we will learn from that and be able to feed that information both around the other schools in Hampshire and on the island, so everybody knows what to expect from Ofsted. I suspect whether they start from the beginning of the spring term or whether that's delayed until Easter will depend a little bit on the data around COVID cases at that particular time, but they certainly won't be inspecting next term.
Thank you, Brian. I was at a small meeting at the LGA where Gavin Williamson came to speak, and in my usual self, I just said, why don't we get rid of Ofsted, which 2 seconds silence, as you can imagine. And he said, oh, we couldn't possibly do that. But I said, well, as far as I'm concerned, I'm not impressed. And as far as authorities are concerned, they cost us all a lot of money when they come visiting. However, he isn't going to get rid of it, unfortunately. But I hope you're right that they leave schools alone for the moment, because schools will have their work cut out accommodating children from September onwards. Right, Councillor Price, now is your turn. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. Just a couple of things. First of all, I'd reiterate the thank you to all the teachers, head teachers and deputy heads and so on that have, you know, dealt with this in an incredible way, but also to thank the many people behind the scenes, like officers and so on in the Education Authority, who probably aren't getting any thanks, really. It's a huge job to deal with this particular issue. I have 2 children at primary school, so I'm seeing the whole situation firsthand. I think most of us want the normal to come back, whilst wanting to do the right thing as well. The whole experience of primary school is, for instance, a mixture of things, including the everyday, but also those social things, sports days, school trips and things, which you know, I've got a family member whose daughter was in year 6 and's just left today to go to secondary school, and you know, it's those children that have missed out on all those lovely things in year 6. It's been so hard to get those moments back, and their preparation for secondary school has obviously been lost. So there's some really heartbreaking things that have happened there for the development of those children. But something I wanted to mention is that from what I've heard from residents and various other parents from other schools and so on, there seems to be quite a variation in how schools have adapted to the home learning process. And I know there's probably no way to have had a level playing field with that, because every school's different. The cohorts of the classes and so on are different, and there's many variations across the scale and perhaps the different areas of the Isle of Wight in particular. But there has been quite a variation, I think, in that, which I don't expect you to answer that in any way, but you probably are aware of some of those differences, and some of it in different schools is actually just from year to year. It's not necessarily the school. It is perhaps year groups where it's been particularly different in the level of content that's been available, whether it's been online content, online teaching, and the lessons that are going, the lesson material that's been going back home for the parents to deal with. But the question I've got really is, and you touched on it earlier, is about the potential for more online teaching, because of course, if we do have another phase of this, or a second spike or whatever, and we ended up in this situation all over again, which I don't think anyone wants us to be in that situation. It would be dreadful for this generation of children going through schools now. But if that was the case, could you tell us a little bit more about what's being developed in respect to perhaps almost a part or full day online? We've adapted it with our meetings and stuff, and with the likes of Zoom. I mean, my daughter's in Cubs. We've been still having Cubs, but on Zoom. We had a Cubs party. My daughter did a Cubs quiz, all on Zoom, and it was absolutely fantastic. We had a weekend camping event with the whole of the Isle of Wight Cubs on Zoom, and there's been a lot of things that have been able to carry on, and I just wonder whether those kind of things are going to be looked at to the future if we end up in this situation again. And I know there is an issue with technology, because obviously not all families have technology, but in a little group that I deal with within a school, we wanted to put out something to parents to ask if there was redundant equipment that could be donated, and whether councils have the facility to quickly just delete and reinstall Windows back onto those devices, so they could go out to families that haven't got a device. I think there's an awful lot of potential for volunteers to come forward and offer stuff free of charge that could probably be refurbished and given to those parents that haven't got the equipment quite quickly if it was necessary. So just wondered if you could sort of touch on those two particular points about online learning if we were in this situation going forward, and what's the possibility of bringing in equipment from the public to go out to families that maybe don't have it. Thank you.
Can I firstly say, I think perhaps one of the things I omitted during my presentation was a thank you to the children and young people as well of the island, because you're quite right, some of their experiences have been quite extraordinary compared to previous years, and I'd particularly say those children in year 6 in terms of preparation for secondary, but equally those children that have done 11, 12 years of learning and then have been unable to do their GCSEs, and the island probably has got a debt to those children, because by staying at home and staying safe, they've prevented the spread of COVID and actually probably saved lives on the island. So, thank you, children, for everything they've done. In terms of home learning, it's really interesting what we're learning from that. And I think there's more learning to do early next term when all the students are back. So one of the bits we're learning is those schools that went rapidly to live streaming, they're finding that very little of that learning stuck, which might sound really counterintuitive. You might think that's the best sort of learning. However, what they're saying is, when you look at how children learn best, it tends to be more interactive, with children being given extended periods of time to do some work independently, for teachers to unpick and assess the learning that's gone on in there to address any misconceptions. It's then about producing really good feedback. It's noticing which child in a group situation has got it and which hasn't. And the other key bit of learning, all the Education Endowment Fund says, is peer-to-peer learning. and that's really difficult as well in a kind of Teams environment like this. You'll find you can't spark off each other as well tonight as we could if we were sat in a room. So what we're finding, some really interesting lessons about what works and what doesn't. We want to do some evaluation early next term when the children are actually back into schools and work with schools about what works and what doesn't. I think what we need to, I'm not sure the phrase online learning is a particularly helpful one. I think probably the phrase remote learning is the phrase we'll adopt. This is the phrase that the government and the DfE are now using. And for me, it's probably more blended. It's use of technology to perhaps do lesson lesson introductions, to pull together some key facts and do plenaries, to start things off, but with some tasks in between for the children to engage with, because one of the key bits is they can work independently as well. So I think there are huge lessons to learn, Matthew. We need to do that properly. The other bit I'd say is, yeah, it doesn't surprise me at all that you've had variance from teacher to teacher. No teacher had ever attempted remote learning before March the 20th, and that was never part of their degree course they did to go into teaching. So it's all been a brand new learning experience for them as well. So like you, they've been finding their way with the technology and what works and what doesn't. And what you'd like to think is over time, we'll learn from each other on that, and actually moving forward there'll be a greater amount of consistency. But there's a bit about being patient with teachers as they were trying to learn what works and what doesn't, I think. But your point's really well made.
Any more questions? Sorry, oh yes, because I can't see that. Right, Councillor Brading, please.
Just check my camera. Yeah, good evening, everyone. I just want to pick up on a few points. A really good debate from a presentation, yeah, really detailed presentation. It was always a difficult one when the government decided to shut schools in March. The right decision, very easy one to make. I always knew that at some point we would have to reopen schools, and that would be a very, very tricky situation to address. So when they started talking about, you know, their plans, my immediate reaction was, unlike Brian and Steve, who got a B in chemistry, and mine would rank on the D grade. So, you know, following government advice and the experts' advice was, for me, the right thing to do for the islands. I think if you follow government advice, you've got a structure to work to. That was an easy decision for me to make in that respect. You know, I had to defend it on radio and TV, but then it's on my officers to put that into play. And, you know, I've got to thank Brian and his team have done a fantastic job with all the, you know, with all the staff. All the staff in schools have been absolutely brilliant, where they've stepped up. And there's no rule book for this. There's no guidance for this. Teachers have never taught remotely before. The way they've adapted and come up with some innovative things has been absolutely brilliant. To pick up Matt's point, actually, about year 6, you're right, yeah, year 6 have missed out on some of the end of year niceties. But I've seen so many year 6 YouTube videos. I've seen virtual assemblies that have been YouTubed and shared with me. I also feel sorry for, obviously, for All Saints, which has now closed. All Saints did a phenomenal closing video. I don't know if you've seen it or not. The YouTube video for the All Saints closing was just absolutely brilliant. The head teacher dancing with the kids. It's absolutely brilliant. So you know, schools have found new ways of doing things at times of trouble. And pick up Rodney's point. I know Rodney mentioned Ofsted. I was a governor for 22 years and I hated Ofsted. I thought they were absolutely ridiculous. But now I've visited every school on the island, I always look at their Ofsteds before I go and do a school visit. And I've read all the Ofsteds across the whole island. And what I see, I compare what I see to what I read before I go. And I have to say, my view on Ofsted has changed, especially with the new framework, not being all about results. There's only one Ofsted probably on the island that I thought, to use the banking term, words and figures differ. You know, what I read was not what I saw. But all the rest of them, I have to say, what I read before I go is what I see. So my view on Ofsted has changed. Now I've looked at more Ofsteds in a wider picture. It's right that they're suspending them for the time being. But going forward, you've got to have some benchmark for the school to work to. And if Ofsteds are constructive and helpful, an action plan was out of it for the benefit of the children, it has to be the right thing in my book for the benefit of the children. So thanks for the debate, the team, and thanks for letting me comment. And thanks for the presentation from Stuart and Brian. Thank you.
Vanessa, there was a question around how many cases we'd have that I've not addressed in the presentation. Any child that is what they call a suspected case, so they've got some of the symptoms, comes across my desk, and typically we get 1 a week of those, and they're almost always negative. You'll know in the early days that right at the start of this, that when people had the symptoms, they didn't necessarily have a test, they just went home and got isolated, and so you never knew whether they were positive or not. What I can say is from the 1st of June, so from when schools have been back and those cases, schools have been open to more children, there hasn't been a positive case identified of a school child on the island. We've had one school on the island, part of a national testing scheme, 2 in Hampshire, where every single child and every single teacher has been tested every single week. And I have to say, for all 3 schools, they're yet to find a positive case. And I hope that's reassuring for parents as well, that the cases are so low on the island.
Yes, that is reassuring, and I think possibly we perhaps can arrange a press release for that, because that will help parents when they want to send their children back to school in September, if they realise that the island does have a relatively low number of cases anyway. So I will talk to my leader about that, because obviously some parents are terrified about sending their children back, thinking, oh gosh, you know, I've seen it already myself. So thank you for that. Any more questions from anybody? No, I'd like to bring, hold on a second. Yes, Paul?
A couple more slides left.
Oh, 2 more slides left, sorry. I apologise. Right, so can we go to the next slide then, please?
So I'll take these, and hopefully these are now on your screen. It's a couple more sections. I'll be brief on them because they're a little bit technical, but they're important as we go forward. So firstly, there's a slide just on our school construction and repair processes, and the key message from here is that actually the majority of construction sites remained open whilst adhering to government guidance. A few closed down initially, but all essential school repair and maintenance work is back on track. There's a bit of productivity that might be a bit lower, but in general we're roughly where we'd want to be on that. I'm going to move into just early years, and there's early years has been nationally has been a tricky area, not least because as this slide shows you, there are a variety of different providers and a different means of funding early years. So there are childminders, preschools, nursery schools, maintained nurseries, etc., etc. And there's also different methods of funding. Some are funded through early years universal entitlement, some are privately funded, and there is a mix of the two. And incentives in one area can become disincentives in another area, and it can be mind-bendingly complicated in terms of what's the best thing to do. And I think it would be fair to say that the DfE have not yet hit upon the right thing, and maybe there just isn't a right thing to do in these circumstances, because it is very tricky. So this is some of the story around this. On 17th of March, government confirmed that local authorities continue to pay for free early years entitlement for 2, 3 and 4 year olds, even if settings were closed. And we were asked by the DfE to get the early years entitlement funding out quickly to support providers with cash flow, which we did, which subsequently led to a bit of a tumbleweed moment with the DfE when they subsequently asked us to change the way that we apportioned that. And we told them it was too late to do it because we'd already followed their guidance and sent out the money. So and we weren't the only, every authority fed that back, but it was the DfE being a little bit slow off the mark there, I think. As you can see from this slide, from 23rd, all key workers and vulnerable children who needed a place were able to access one. We did some brokering between different providers to make sure so that people could get those places. Not every person had their provider that they previously used, but we managed to sort of plug the gaps. There was initially quite a lot of confusion within the sector around furlough and what could and couldn't be done, and that required clarification from the DfE in due course. You'll see that we made PPE available, and we also on the island were able to make small business grants for preschools who met the criteria for that. We also funded, there was effectively double funding for some key workers and vulnerable children. In other words, we funded the places as well as funding the places that they weren't going to because they were part of the early years entitlement but were closed. So that there was some trickiness around that, but we managed to get through that. And rather like the schools sector, we published a whole range of frequently asked questions and guidance to help providers get through. This was our return to the DfE. You'll see that we had 93 settings, of which 20 were closed and 73 remained open. That was the week ending we commenced the 25th of the 6th, I think it was. And you can see the numbers there, the number of children that were attending at that stage. In the future, there are some issues for the sector as a whole, and I don't think the Isle of Wight is any different from a national picture on this. There are some financial challenges that's added to the council's costs. So the cost of fixed prices, the loss of earnings from privately funded children for providers. We don't yet know what take-up will be in the autumn term, and furlough will end at that stage. And there are additional costs around access to hygiene supplies. So that all will play out in September. And our information at the moment is that we should have capacity, but it's an area that causes us concern because this is mostly almost entirely private sector, so we can't control it directly. There also are issues that are slightly improved recently around wraparound care, by which we mean breakfast clubs and after school clubs, and the initial guidance around that was not helpful, to be honest, but that's now improved, and we've also managed to get some summer schemes up and running on the island, so that's really helpful, and we would hope that that will come back online in the autumn. A lot of that's done through schools, as you can imagine. There's a sort of nebulous thing around parental confidence, as we've talked about earlier in the session, about whether parents feel confident enough in terms of dropping their young children off with providers, and that's something we've got to work on with those providers in the course of the next 6 months. And we've also got to look at what the longer term changes to employment and working patterns will mean. If more people are working from home and working different patterns, will that mean that there will be fewer childcare providers, or will they need to adapt and work at different hours and in different ways? That's all to play for, but we've got an eye on that as well. The other area we want to talk about is homeschool transport. You can see here the business as usual service, and during lockdown very much reduced. There was a requirement to pay bus and coach operators at 100%. From the DfT, and small taxi companies we paid at least 50%. There is a thing there about making sure that we've got a service there for the future. You'll see in the recovery we had about 70 year 10 travellers attending. Some services were reduced, as Southern Vectis reported no children travelling, and we managed to get children into the special school. We are still awaiting the DfE guidance for September on homeschool transport, and it's not good that that's not appeared yet. but we are in contact with schools about what that might mean. We understand that there will be no social distancing on closed door contracts, in other words, for school-specific buses. But we'll need to work out how to put those pupils into bubbles, if possible, on those buses. So year 7 sitting together, year 8 sitting together, etc., so that they're consistent with what happens in the school. Apparently, the current the draft guidance. I say apparently. I know full well because I've seen it. The draft guidance says that we shouldn't be doing deliveries to 2 settings. I think that guidance will change because we fed back very strongly that that's extremely unhelpful, and I know a number of authorities have fed back that feedback. So we'll see what happens in the final version, and we are exploring with parents about different methods of children with special educational needs, getting those into school. Some parents are actively wanting to take their children to school to minimise contact with others, and also we're exploring things like mileage, paying parents mileage rates to bring them rather than other forms of transport. Finally, I'll skip this. I'll move over this slide very quickly, but there was a bit of business as usual that happened while all this has gone, which was the primary admissions day on 16th of April. And that concluded with 98.5% of parents being offered a year in reception for their child in one of their 3 preferred choices. I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to move us through that. So that was the final slide, and happy to take any questions on that, or indeed, as we wrap up, anything else that you might want to ask questions on.
Thank you very much, Steve. None of these people have ever tried to run a transport system. I mean, how you keep children apart on a bus, quite frankly, I've got Paul sitting here laughing. However, what people don't seem to realise is that Southern Vectis, in fact, every coach and bus company in the country, have the most extensive cleaning operation at the end of the day. Those buses and coaches are completely sterilised. Perhaps that's something we need to get over to parents, but it isn't the children that are so much at risk, I presume. It's the fact that children might carry the virus home to their parents, because, as I said, the children aren't at risk. It's very, very unlikely to get it. However, do I have any questions from my team, please? So thank you, Steve, for that presentation. That actually was very informative. As you said, we will just have to see what happens. I mean, what frightens me most of all is that we won't have a bus company at all. In a small area like the Isle of Wight, we only can sustain 1 coach bus company anyway, and if they go up the wall, goodness knows what we'll do. And mileage, to pay mileage to parents to bring their children to school, can you imagine the bureaucracy involved in that? However, in which case I think we go on to the next item. Now, the lady who is going to talk now is the head teacher of the school where I am a governor, which is Haylands Primary School. Good evening, Lisa.
Hello, everybody. Yes, I am the head teacher of Haylands Primary School, but what I hope that I say this evening represents schools across the island. So Vanessa asked me to talk to you about what it's been like to actually be on the ground in schools, and I believe my presentation will be shared, and perhaps you've already seen it, and I'll just run through that and perhaps add a few bits in which I know that you've been discussing, so that then you can I can sort of put the meat on the bones really around different questions you've asked. So can we have the next slide, please? So as Brian said, the announcement that schools were closing was quickly followed by the fact that we wouldn't be totally closed. Now at Haylands, over that closure period, we had roughly 40 children that used the provision, but mainly around 25 attending. The children that attended 5 days a week tended to be your vulnerable children, and the children that added backwards and forwards with that number were the children of those essential workers, hospital workers, anybody on that list. For us, initially, we thought we could be overwhelmed with over 100 children, but I think that parents quickly realised that they really should only send their child to school if there was no other care. Because we knew our families needed that care, we did remain open for every bit of the time that schools were officially closed, the bank holidays, etc. And we felt that particularly in the Ryde area, we needed to give that sense of continuity to our families, whether it was through the office being open so that they could ring in. Just to say, Hayland School is still here. We did keep in touch with some of our staff because, like all industries, we had people that were in that vulnerable group, so unable to come to school. But I put in a quote for you because that is from one of my staff to just show what they felt. This isn't just a presentation from me. I'm hoping it gives you a sense of the whole school. In terms of meal provision, we do use Caterlink, but we were insistent that for our vulnerable families, we wanted hot meal provision and not packed lunches. Packed lunches were just provided for the holidays and for children that we could deliver packed lunch to. But we felt definitely children that were vulnerable needed that hot meal in the middle of the day. Can I have the next slide, please? I know many of you, some of the questions have been around managing the home learning. Because we were beginning to anticipate school closure in that week, we went into mass production of work packs for the children to take away with them as school's closure happened, and that did give them something to be getting on with. But we were also fortunate that we also already had Google Suite, and we have a very good IT team. So the teachers had kind of dabbled, I want to say, in the Google Suite, but not really used it outside of sort of emailing, really. And so we rapidly moved to Google Classroom. I know many of you have asked questions around, you know, how that worked, etc., for families. Was it all day in front of the screen? And we tried to produce a variety of tasks, some of which were going to be on screen, some of it which weren't. We did use the maths resources that were produced and available for all families. But we were still aware that children might not have that internet access. Maybe they don't have a device, maybe their family hasn't got the internet. Our day-to-day contact between class teachers and families was by something called Dojo, and that's very similar to sort of a texting service, but it's teacher to staff members and very easily accessible by a phone. But we would monitor who we were having contact with, and so we knew that some families we would have to actually call, because if we hadn't heard from them, why hadn't we heard from them? And that goes back to the presentation earlier about safeguarding children. We also set up the idea of a learning record, because on Google Classroom, if you submit work, you will know who's submitted work, who's looked to see what the work is. And so we were really aware of if there's somebody not accessing work, they're not communicating via Dojo, they're not calling into the school office, that means that we need to prioritise those pupils for our safeguarding potential risk. Parents have been really positive with us about home learning. We've also encouraged children to send us photos, which you can do via Dojo, Tapestry or Google Classroom, on different things they've done. So I know one of my year 5s has become an expert carpenter and has been making troughs, flower troughs for friends and family, something that he would have never had the opportunity to do. I'm also aware of someone who's taken up fishing and has been really pleased to have time with their parent to do something different. Baking has been really popular, so what we've cooked and done at home. So it's the idea of valuing everything that you're learning to do, not just have you completed your maths work, because I'm aware that you were asking questions around that. Can I have the next slide, please? I've mentioned the ring around service. As lockdown happened, we were already very aware of our families that, despite, you know, they might not be on a social services list anywhere, but they were your families that you know are more needy. You know that they might have trouble with their children's behaviour, they might have trouble for poverty, you know that their home life is slightly in crisis, that the family's recently split up. And so we straight away started with a ring around service. Now Haylands has got over 400 children and we started with about 150 that we were ringing round. So it was literally all staff members, teaching staff members were allocated their ring around list, normally from their class, or it would be the family liaison officer if she knew that the family had previously been known to social services or on early help. Because as we mentioned earlier, this type of situation may send a family back into crisis. So the ring around list we also then altered depending on the contact that we were having via the work packs, dojo, and what the parental response was when we were ringing around. We did have some families that if we didn't get an answer on the phone or nobody had heard from them, we would undertake home visits. That was myself, my SENCO, my family liaison officer. And it just meant that we wanted to see those children. And the outcome of that is, even if they didn't exist on a social services list or children's services list, it meant that if we felt that they were more at risk, we would offer them a place. And I know that one of the families that I visited, we offered a place, and as we uncovered more, it's quite quickly gone to child in need. So for us, it's that partnership working, knowing what's going on the ground really, and how we might meet those children's needs and how we link with other services. Being able to deliver food bank vouchers or essential items such as breakfast cereals, etc., also gave us the chance to chat with the parent sort of from the distance of the front door, see the children, talk to them, so you got that feeling of how the family were doing. As Brian mentioned, we had the vulnerable children's return, and some of the referrals that we made in over the time or that come in meant that we added to the children's the children that were known to children's services, but equally we could see who had been stepped down, so that was really good, a communication method. If I could have the next slide, please. Well, when we return to school, we are fortunate enough in that our school is quite large. Our classrooms are roughly all the same size because Haylands is a relatively new built school. That amongst my staff who were unable to work in school because they were considered vulnerable or critically vulnerable, then they could carry on with home learning for some of our pupils, and we could manage to operate 14 bubbles across our school with the staff that we had. I think there was quite a lot in the press about the uptake. Well, we had 43% of our school population in, and you can see the figures. We followed all the government guidance, and at the end of my presentation there is a link to a video that we made about returning to school on the 1st of June. But we were really aware that we needed to continue to provide online learning, but that we needed to make it more personable. And I think that relates to one of your questions, where what about the interaction and the idea of live recorded lessons? We didn't do live recorded lessons, so we would set work, but as we developed our technology, we learned how to use something called Loom, which Loom allows you to share a presentation such as this, pre-record your voice with it, so that the children can watch it, pause it, look at it. You don't need to record the whole of a lesson. You can record the introduction, and you can say, when you've submitted your work, I'm going to have a look and then I'm going to come back to you. We also learned how to use something called Mote. And Mote allows you to do voice recordings for children's work, so that it means that the children still get some form of personal comment about what they've done, not a typed comment. And you don't need to have, if you're young and you're only year 1, you don't have to read your teacher's comment. You can hear their voice to say that they've looked at what you've done at home. We did the risk assessments for children with educational healthcare plans, and we've had many of ours that don't have an underlying health condition return to school. Parents have been fantastic in understanding that potentially they might not have a learning support assistant with them all the time. It might be someone different. They're not in their familiar group. But the response for those children coming into school has been really positive. And because my Senko takes a bubble, I've had a couple of annual reviews with the parents during this time, and they've been really positive about how the school has supported their child at this time. My next slide, if we click on, is some of my parents' views. We've done quite a few videos that we've put on our Facebook page, and these have come from those comments that parents have made. So any of the spelling, punctuation or grammar errors are not mine. They are directly lifted from that. And I just think that we know how much our parents have appreciated what we've done by reading those. Can I have the next slide, please? Well, we're ready to go. Halen still hasn't finished school, so I've been to school all day. I'm in school all day tomorrow. We've had our year 6 water fight today across the bubbles, all on the field, to try to make the end of year 6 seem really special to them. We've got all our staff coming back. We've sorted out how we're going to do the timetabling, the staggering ends, the breaks, etc. The risk assessment has been updated. I think for us, what was really important was the idea of transition, because we normally run transition events for every year group, not just year 6 going to secondary, not just year R coming into preschoolers coming into year R. And we knew that our children had missed that. So we began with making booklets where it said who are the staff going to be, and it was interesting facts about them. So you had to like share some of your secrets, you know, interesting fact about you, what you liked best, who was in your family, to make them quite humorous for the children. And we encouraged the children to submit theirs in response, so the class teacher knew more about them. We then did welcome videos from the class team so that the children could put face to a name, hear them talk about what they liked, and they all went out via Google Classroom and on Facebook. Then we'd organise bubble picnics, so that's still only in bubbles of 15 because that's the current guidelines. So it meant that outside on our school field, you came, just your bubble came, and you brought a snack and a drink and you played some socially distanced team games to enable those children to think about coming back to school. And one of the things I'm producing for September is the friendly version of the rules. So it doesn't say don't, it says do and remember. and I will be able to record that with my voice, so that just before we return to school, I can post it and say, looking forward to seeing you tomorrow. Remember this, remember that. And so we feel really positive. Obviously, with any service, there's the unknown. There's the unknown whether there will be a second wave, whether there'll be a spike, how many children will actually return. From our bubble picnics, out of each 15 bubble, we've normally had about 12 to 15 attend, so we feel confident. We're aware of the fact that children may have gaps in their learning. A parent spoke to me today at the bubble picnic and she said, I couldn't help her with her maths and I'm really worried that she's going to be really behind. And this is a child going into year 5. And I said, just don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. We'll unpick where they need catch up, keep up. And so we know that we've got that work to do to recover what they might not have embedded as learning, but also maintaining that emotional support. In my video to parents and my letter to parents, I said, we can't know all of your home circumstances, how this has affected you, but know that we're here to listen. We have an emotional needs assistant, we have a family liaison officer, we have an inclusion leader. So if you're worried about the return to school or you think we need to know what it's been like for you, get in contact. I think for me is that overwhelming team spirit that I've got at Haylands, and I'm sure it's the same for many schools. You know, we're all in this together, and we all have to collectively give what we can to make the best of what is a really difficult situation. Can I have the next slide? And so I thought I'd share with you some of the views of the staff. You know, we have worked phenomenally hard to make sure all the information is shared. I've even done video staff meetings, so I'll talk to the staff I have, I'll do it via, we use Zoom or Google Classroom more than Teams, so that I can share what we're doing. I've also, if I'm going to send out information to the parents, I might pre-record it, the letter. So I'll have the letter on screen in my voice and say, this is what's going to parents. These are questions they may ask you. And so the staff have been really positive about how well we've communicated everything. And I haven't got a single person that's saying, I'm not happy to return to school. Everybody is so willing to be in. And finally, on my last slide, I just want to say something that happened today that's not on here is we got a classic FM request, and it was from a grandparent at of a child at our school that gave us a shout out on classic FM. So that was really good news. You know, I just again want to re-emphasize that schools, not just my school, but every school wants the best for the children that attend their school. Nobody went into teaching to do it badly, and I know that the staff have really pulled together, and I've put that link for you to look at in your leisure, and that is around what we said to the children before they came back on the 1st of June to try to make it much smoother for them to understand what had happened. I just want to thank you for your time and attention, and I'm happy to take any questions, but I would prefer them in writing. I just know, as many head teachers feel at this moment, my concentration, my ability to think straight after constantly being at school is a little vague after all this time, and it's the last week, and my family all going, when's it dinner time? So thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. That's a brilliant presentation, and I hope that everybody else understands why I wanted to come online. I thought the sort of absolutely everything. And Brian, I defy you to find a flaw in it. Just one other point. I had an email. As staff governor here at Haylands, to enforce what you've already said, we need to share our experience of lockdown. Mrs. Nicholson has led from the top in the run-up to and during the period of uncertainty, and already has robust plans to lead us into the new academic year. She's managed to continually engage all groups, parents, carers, staff and children with a constant flow of updated information and guidance. We are all being offered total inclusion with the volume of communication which is being sent out. All other schools have faced the same challenges, but Mrs. Nicholson has expertly pushed Haylands forward to be a model of what can be achieved during this difficult period. The effective deployment of staff to ensure the planning and provision of the children's learning for both those in and out of school has been successful while maintaining the morale of both staff and children. So that is from one of her staff. So thank you, Lisa.
Thank you.
Questions, please. Very, very short, quick questions, if you don't mind.
Is that Stephen going to ask?
Thank you, Chairman.
You can
Lisa,
go and cook dinner, my dear.
Lisa, it sounds like you've done an amazing job with your school over the period. Do you have the opportunity to share your kind of best practice with other head teachers? And I suppose the other question is, do you have any spaces for my children in September?
Depends which year group. As answer to that first one, we haven't been formally asked, but today one of my staff members was working with a school in Sussex, I believe, who are early beginners with Google Classroom, and she gave a overview via Google Classroom on making the best use of it. So that was really fortunate. I know that she's been approached by the school her children go to also ask about how we've managed what we've managed. But I think it's a very difficult question because every school is in a very unique circumstance. As I said, you know, Haylands building lent itself well to bubble groups of 15. My staff to vulnerable people ratio worked almost, I want to say, to my advantage. If I had, on a 2-form entry, if I had one staff member per year group in, I had one off. So I wasn't in that situation. And so I think I would always be willing to help anyone if they felt like, oh, what did you do about that? The RIDE cluster had a WhatsApp group, and so we have a little bit of a discussion about what's happening in each other's schools. The meetings that we had as head teachers fortnightly in areas meant that we were able to share what we were doing, but everybody's school situation is unique, and you have to think, what do I need to do for my school?
Brilliant, thank you.
Thank you, Lisa.
Paul, is it an easy one?
Is that the end of the item?
Yes, I think that is the end of the item. Lisa, you can go home and cook dinner, and thank you very much for the presentation.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye, everyone. Bye.
Yes, what my Paul is saying, any particular outcomes that anybody wants to raise, or can we move on to the next item? Yes, Councillor Fuller.
Thank you, Vanessa. It's brilliant to hear from Lisa, who's doing the job really well. And I know that in the Cows area, there's also similar schools that have done very, very well. And the feedback that we are having from parents are very, very good. However, there are some schools that perhaps haven't stepped up to the plate as well as Haylands School has and other schools have. They're the schools that need support. What support are we giving to those schools that have found difficulty? I think Brian said earlier on that he was touching base with all teachers every single week. Now, there's clearly a few schools that have found it not as easy as others, and I'm just wondering what support will we be giving them if there is a second wave? I'm sorry to be so negative on this, but I think as a scrutiny committee, we have to look at the challenges as well as the good stuff that's going on.
Yes,
Sorry about that.
If I can come in, Chair, I'm sure Brian will want to come as well, but you're absolutely right. You're right to challenge. There's absolutely no problem there. One thing I would caution is that it's quite tricky, but every single school has a different set of circumstances. So you heard about another school, I think, that had a lot of teachers that were pregnant and they're shielding, and that means that they have less capacity to do the things that you've just heard about. Other schools have got teachers who are shielded for other reasons, and we can't, for obvious reasons. And I know that some heads have found it difficult to convey that to parents because they can't talk about other individuals' health issues. That's not fair and that's not allowed, and that's fully understandable. But they then get slightly boxed in about what they can and can't say, which means it feels like they're not doing well enough. Whereas in actual fact, they're using their resources to the max. It's just they haven't got the same resource. So it is very, very contextual. And as you say, we have been having those weekly conversations with schools. We'll continue to have those. I know. Brian, do you want to pick up anything additional from that?
I mean, just to say, it's the right question to ask, Paul, but we haven't had any schools on the island where there's been a horror show throughout this. You know, they've all in their own way, and I know that's not what you're suggesting. They've done a really great job. So the phone call on a weekly basis is a minimum, and we've done inverse proportion to success. Some schools on the island have had almost daily conversations, and sometimes for several hours at a time. And that's been by our primary phase inspectors, who have all been primary heads in their own right, so know what it's like to sit in the big chair. And similarly with the secondary schools as well, they've been from experienced school improvement colleagues. Equally, where we've found a school that's been struggling, but a school up the road has been doing a good job, we've put the two in touch with each other so they could learn from each other as well. So we've tried to get some school-to-school support in place. But we're not letting any school flounder on their own. If they need a daily conversation, several hours, we'll be there through thick and thin to make sure that happens. We just will be, Paul.
Right. I fully understand that, Brian, but I think, you know, certainly when you get parents who aren't aware of what's going on within the environment of the school, and I think schools are very good at promoting their stuff, but sometimes they don't always sort of like say, we have a problem here. Can you as parents help and support us? And I think that to me is a bit of a worry. You know, I've had parents contacting me saying, well, this school, I'm not going to name names because it wouldn't be fair for me to do so, but they've said this school, we don't feel that we're getting the same information. We're not getting the same breadth of information for our secondary students as our primary students are getting. We see a marked contrast, and maybe parents are taking unfair comparisons there. But I think that it's a question I wanted to ask, and I feel really reassured by what you've said, Stephen and Brian. So thank you for that. Thank you.
Right. Thank you. I would like to formally thank all staff in children, social care, education, schools and support services for their hard work in maintaining a high standard of service throughout an extremely difficult period. I know I bumped into one lady from who is in local the children in care, and she said to me, Vanessa, I've never worked so hard in my life, and I suspect that goes all the way across the board. So as a committee, I would like it recorded, our genuine and heartfelt thanks to all those people involved. Thank you. We'll now go on.
Chair, can I just thank you for those kind words, and I'll ensure that they're passed on in some way, shape or form to our staff. That's really helpful. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Steve. Right, the next item is SACRE, the annual report. to consider the annual report from SACRE. We haven't got anybody here.
We've got Mr. Harry Kirby and Dr. Hannah.
Right.
Yes, I'm here.
Yes, Chair. I think we've got. Patricia Hannam. Yes, we have. Yes, to talk to this paper.
Good. Welcome, Dr. Hannam.
Thank you. I haven't got a PowerPoint. I thought we can speak together. So my name's Pat Hannam. I'm County Inspector Advisor for RE and History and Philosophy, working with HIAS. And I'm here to present the SACRE annual report for 2018-2019. We always operate a year behind. The 2019-20 report is in preparation, as you can imagine. Right now, will be discussed at SACRE's autumn meeting. I just wanted to spend a few minutes introducing SACRE to the committee. Local authorities have a responsibility to ensure that there is a standing agreed conference for religious education, that's SACRE, and I've acted as SACRE professional advisor for about the last 6 years since we came into a relationship with two authorities. And the Isle of Wight SACRE has been clerked by Harry Kirby, who's here as well, since 2005. SACREs are comprised legally of 4 groups. Group A consists of representatives of religious groups representing the area of the SACRE, and Isle of Wight Group A has representatives from all the Christian denominations on the island, including Baptist, United Reformed, Methodist, Quaker and Roman Catholic. Church of England has its own group. This is as legally constituted under the 88 Education Act, and that form constitutes Group B. Group A also includes other religions such as Buddhist representatives, membership from the Muslim community, including the Imam from the mosque in Newport, as well as Jewish and Hindu representatives, as well as a Baha'i from the island, and we also have a humanist representative. So the Isle of Wight SACRE is a greatly diverse body representing many people of many faiths and none, as well as local authority representatives. So we have 2 county councillors on SACRE and 2 other people nominated by the authority, and there are also teachers there. And they have a responsibility, 2 key responsibilities of the SACRE. One is to advise you, a local authority, on an agreed syllabus for teaching RE, because religious education is not part of the national curriculum, but it has to be locally agreed. And in 2015-16, Isle of Wight SACRE joined with Portsmouth, Hampshire, Southampton to review the agreed syllabus together, and we've adopted all, have the same syllabus for the use on the island school. Now we're in the process of review, which statutorily we're required to do every 5 years. So there will be a new syllabus in place for use in the islands schools in the autumn of 2021. Now the other key responsibility that the SACRE has on behalf of the local authority is to monitor the effectiveness of religious education on the island schools and the effectiveness of the implementation of the agreed syllabus. And the report that you have in front of you is effectively an outcome of that monitoring process. So what's the point of RE? In your agreed syllabus, which is on the Isle of Wight Authority website, on page 4, we clearly spell out what's the point of RE, what are we seeking to achieve in our schools. And first of all, we want to introduce children and young people to what a religious and non-religious way of existing in the world may offer, individually and collectively, knowing that what it means to be religious isn't one thing. And we want to make an educational difference in the lives of children. And what we feel is that at this point in local, British and international history, we'd argue strongly that high quality religious education is an important contribution to the broad, balanced education received by all children on the Isle of Wight. To be prepared to live in the modern world, children and young people will be significantly disadvantaged if they are not both well informed about the people who constitute a whole human community of British society, as well as, perhaps what's more complicated thing, being able to dialogue across that difference. We don't think or see things in the same way, and one of the challenges of a democracy is knowing how to live well with others who think and act differently from oneself. So this is why the Isle of Wight Agreed Syllabus, Living Difference 3, is not just about telling things to children for them to remember, but also a process of teaching. So what we offer to teachers is a way of teaching that enables them to help children think and speak and act in a way required in the modern world. So Living Difference 3 ensures that RE is taught in Isle of Wight schools that adds something significant to that broad, balanced curriculum provided to the island's children. An example of this, in brief, is the skills that we develop in RE. Now, these are the kinds of skills that are transferable to all other subjects as well as to everyday life, but they're particularly well taught in RE. For example, giving one's point of view, giving a reason to support why you think what you think, as well as coming to appreciate that it's never the case that all of a group of people will see things in exactly the same way. So that's a kind of logic, really, that if one person says such and such a thing, so if they see one representative of community, we'd want them to know that they should never generalize from that to the whole community. And ultimately, good quality RE should build good interrelationships between people. Importantly, however, we intend children to be able to relate what is essentially human to what to live a life, as also to relate that to what it means to live with a religious orientation. So starting with something that's close to all our hearts, such as discussion about community. This would then lead to an intellectual engagement, perhaps in Key Stage 3, with a unit on Christianity, looking at the church, or a unit on Islam, looking at Ummah, which is a nuanced understanding of this, or in Buddhism, to a consideration of the concept of Sangha. Anyway, always there will be a case study relating to contemporary ways of life, and this helps us to achieve the purpose. But regarding the report, I just wanted to draw your attention to some headlines, in that we're able to implement the agreed syllabus very well on the island. And what the report notes is that we've had some very successful and very well attended network meetings for primary and secondary teachers, and they're now being held on the island, and these are really contributing to raising the standards of RE and bringing teachers together to explore the very best ways of teaching to ensure consistent approach across the island, and the network meetings are mentioned in the report. Another thing that is mentioned in the report is that we were delighted to be able to access some funding to hold for the first time a conference for Isle of Wight teachers in October of 2018. We accessed some small amount of funding from a national grant making trust for RE to support that conference. We were hoping to hold one this October, but we're going to postpone it, we think, till the spring, and then we'll make a judgment about whether that will be another face-to-face conference or not. When we look at the data, ultimately, when we look at the effectiveness of RE, we're not only looking at the GCSE data, but this is very important, of course. It's an important part of the story, but not the only part of the story. What we need to do legally is make sure that all young people have access to high quality RE at all stages of their education from year R, and unlike other subjects, RE is actually statutory in year R. That's different for the national curriculum, all the way up through to Key Stage 4 and ideally in Key Stage 5. But access to Key Stage 4 RE is variable across the schools, but overall, what we can say is during the last few years, there has been considerable improvement, which I know SACRE would like to celebrate. I think I just leave the rest of that for you to see if there are questions that arose from the report, and Harry is here as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that report and for the written report which we received. Do any of my fellow committee members have any questions for Dr. Hannah? No, it doesn't. I mean, it was pretty comprehensive, thank you, and we do appreciate it. And thank you for coming into our webinar. Sorry, the clerk. He can you call him in?
Am I able to speak?
Yes, please.
Am I on? Sorry. Yes? Okay. Just one or two things to point out, please. I looked through the attendance or the membership of SACRE going back to 2006, 2007. The Isle of Wight SACRE was purely Christian, attended by counsellors and teachers, but there were no representatives from other faiths. It was a group of Roman Catholics, Church of England, a Methodist or a Free Church minister. It was only over the years that SACRE has worked hard to have that inclusivity that you now see on that list. And it is quite a unique group on the island. You'll find nothing like it in any other context. A whole range of faiths working together for the benefit of island children. The other point I'd like to make, and the officers can't do this, but I can, is to thank Patricia and her staff and Hampshire for the support that we're being given. I've been involved with SACRE since 1988. It's a long, long time. I was chairman for a while and things like that. Never has the children on the Isle of Wight had the support for religious education that it's now receiving, both in quality and quantity. As I say, the officers can't say this, but I can. Teachers really do appreciate the support they're being given. Unless there are questions to me, that's my input.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kirby. That's much appreciated. Do any of my fellow committee members have any questions for me? I must admit, I'm delighted to know that Christianity, whatever, what was it that the Irish comedian used to say, may your God go with you, and that is how it should be. Thank you for your input. Yes, could I have a proposal, please, to formally adopt the report from SACRE? Right. Councillor Hendry proposed and Councillor Fuller seconded. Yes, yes, technically I need to, Councillor Price, for or against?
Sorry, Chairman, I've been having some connection problems, but I am still here, but nothing from me, thank you.
No, I need for the report, please, or abstain or against, for the acceptance of.
For.
Thank you. And then Councillor Downer.
There's 4, Chairman, and the comedian was Dave Allen. So your God go with you.
Yes, you're quite right. Thank you, Rodney. And Councillor Churchman, I'm for. Councillor Fuller seconded it, did he not?
Yeah, just beforehand, I'd like to say a big thank you to both Patricia and Harry for all their work getting SACRE the way that it is today. I know they've put in a lot of work, and to make it as inclusive as it is now is, I think, a testament to their efforts, and thank you. I'm for.
Councillor, thank you. Councillor Hendry?
4.
Thank you. That completes roll call. Right, thank you for attending, much appreciated. The last but the penultimate is the work plan. The work plan for 2021.
Chairman, did you want me to introduce this so that we can hopefully move things on? Obviously, the work plan was drafted back in March of this year. There have been obviously developments that would impact on that. So can I suggest that we arrange a meeting between yourself, the cabinet member, and relevant officers to draft a new work plan and bring that back to the committee?
Yes, certainly. I would agree with that, because life has changed, as we all know. So be prepared, folks, that we will have another webinar to discuss the work plan in September. Is that agreed by the rest of the committee? Councillor Downer, or sorry, just a moment. Oh, Steve, you wanted to come in?
It's just to double check, Chair, that am I right in thinking that the next scheduled meeting is the 3rd of September, and that will probably be a virtual meeting? Is that what we are saying at this stage?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. And very happy to work on the scheduling for that meeting. It's not likely that much will have changed in terms of COVID by that stage, I have to say, because the kids won't be back at school. So it's more likely that we can have some standard items on that agenda. And there are 1 or 2 things that we need to get through, including I think the annual adoption report certainly needs to be seen at that stage.
Yes, I would imagine the adoption and foster reports will be the standard item, and then we can discuss the rest of them when we have a vote. We need a vote?
I don't think there's any dissension, Chairman. I think we'll move forward with that.
Fine. And the last thing of all, of course, is any members' questions. Is there?
We've had none submitted, Chairman.
None submitted. So it's exactly 19:30. So I will close the meeting, and I do thank everybody very much for attending. COVID-19 situation. In my
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.